Greetings sailors and welcome back to World of Warships and a first look at the recently released HMS Cheshire, which is the Tier 8 Premium Heavy Cruiser for the Royal Navy. This is an interesting ship after the rather disappointing release of the London. It has some of the same issues with being down-tiered, namely having a pretty short main battery range for its tier. But I think, unlike the London, there are enough other assets available to you that you can at least be guaranteed of having a good time if the matchmaking isn't too bad. If, like the London, you get in a hard down tier where you are maybe one of 2 or 3 tier 8s in a tier 10 match, that gets ugly. There's a much more limited amount you can do under those circumstances, just because getting close enough to use your guns puts you in extreme peril. But otherwise, apart from those ugly situations, which can happen in any cruiser with a relatively short range, I mean, if you look at, for instance, the Japanese heavy cruisers as well, they tend to have the same problem until you get to pretty much tier 10, or well, even really tier 9. You can put the range upgrade on the Ibuki and it's not so bad, but this obviously is a tier 8, so it doesn't get that. And so what I'm showing you here is pretty good circumstances, so bear that in mind. I have had games where I've been down tiered and struggled to do more than 15, 20, 30k damage just because I've been blatted hard out of the water. And I'd have probably had a not dissimilar experience in the Albemarle, except of course that has a spotter plane and this doesn't. So even though that has a slightly worse base main battery range than this, it can extend it at least sometimes, and of course you can also stick on the spotter plane special module to extend the duration of that as well. So what do you get with the Cheshire? Well, it's the same tier, the same guns rather as the tier 9 and 10, the 9.2 inch aka 234mm heavy cruiser guns, which I have to say, if you are not aware, are basically a complete mess in historical terms. They're a weird mishmash of gun and barrel and shell that just don't make any particular kind of sense. So if you care about that stuff, it might bother you slightly, but it's not like this is a ship that was built to begin with. So personally, I'm not that fussed about it. As in-game weapons, they certainly work very well. It really is just the range that's their limiting factor. Alongside the meaty guns, you also have substantial AA for being a tier 8 cruiser, better than the Albemarle. You have a pretty decent base speed of 34 knots, which is a knot faster again than the Albemarle. You have slightly better stealth than the Albemarle, and I'll show the setup I was running at the end of this video, but I actually forewent the concealment module in favour of the I forget what it's called, but the one that gives you extra action time on your consumables, just to test that out, because without it it's 10.6 kilometers. With it you can get to under 10 kilometers, just like the Albemarle, but I felt like 10.6 was comfortable enough ish for the tier. I mean, for the short range it's kind of cutting it a bit fine. Maybe having those extra several hundred meters of stealth could potentially be useful, but if you feel like it, you can use something else in its place. You could even run the double rudder module setup in those last 2 module slots, so that's something I might experiment with as well. But that extra 10% of action time means that in theory my heal's a bit better, my damage control party runs that little bit longer, and of course my Def AA or Hydro, if you should so choose to have that, just like the Albemarle, it's the same long running but short ranged Hydro, will also run of course that bit longer. So it's not a huge bonus. It's honestly the first ship I've tried using that module on since that module rework, But for this ship, with its already good base stealth, I kind of felt like it was worth a go. But you might want to try something different. The only other substantial change I can really think of is that the torpedoes are different. They have 2 kilometers less range, so 8 versus 10 makes them a bit less useful. I haven't gotten to use them that often, but they still hit for around the same damage. I think there's like 100 or 200 damage difference between them. So if you want a good, hard-hitting cruiser for the tier with an excellent fire chance, the base fire chance is something like 24 or 25%, and with how I've got it set up, on this that you're seeing, I've got it up to 27%. It kind of makes up for the low rate of fire, and excellent AA for being a tier 8 cruiser, which I didn't even have enhanced with BFT. So what you're seeing is this ship without BFT. It can be even better still. Yeah, it's quite a good package when you can get it to work. The stuff that you've given up doesn't so much feel like stuff you've given up when you compare it to you know, the London versus the Surrey. Is it the Surrey that was the tier 6? Devonshire. So yeah, this feels more like that difference between Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, with that difference in firepower but also other differences to go along with it. And the biggest sacrifice that you have made compared to the Albemarle is that catapult. You don't get to have that extra bit of range every so often. And playing around with that fixed 16 point whatever kilometer range is a challenge, I'm not going to lie. It can be quite difficult at times, but I think in the case of the Cheshire, it puts it into that category of ship that's challenging but interesting. It certainly helps when people don't focus it that much, but you can see I've already taken a big chunk of damage. And this is one of the things that limits the usefulness of that heavy cruiser heel across the Royal Navy line as a whole, is that you can take substantial heavy damage quite easily, and it limits the use of that, even though it is in theory a pretty good heel. Here's the AP in action, by the way. Not quite enough lead, but the AP against other cruisers, it can do substantial damage. It really can. Most of the time I fire HE in this, but especially against other cruisers and, you know, lower tier battleships at closer ranges, that AP against the broadside can have a really nasty effect. It's not just all about that 27% fire chance HE. This is a point, by the way, where I kind of wish I had Hydro, and that being a British destroyer, it has Hydro it can use on me, but it's British smoke, so it's not going to last long, and their torps have been out already, so I have to be a little bit careful here, but I was reasonably confident I'd be okay. And of course, with these big... oh, there we go. Well, good thing I wasn't too confident and went in a straight line. With these big, chunky 234mm guns, you know, you get a destroyer in these kind of circumstances, and it can hurt a fair bit. So my secondary's pinging away a bit there as well. This, by the way, was my first game in the production version, or the live version of this ship. And I should say, and I keep forgetting to say at the start of the video, but yeah, this was also provided by Wargaming, just in case anyone was wondering. I didn't rush out and buy this. But if I hadn't been given it, it's one I would strongly have considered getting myself at some point. It's just an interesting ship to play for its tier. So far in this match, you'll see it's actually fairly even in terms of ships, but we've held a good lead in terms of cap points, so we have some cushion to work with here. You're also going to get to see now much more of the AA in action, because this Lexington is getting increasingly worried that I'm getting close to them. And that's because they haven't moved an inch from the back border, which is basically them having spawned, gone into reverse until they hit the border, and then just sat there. And so I'm going to get a nice chunk of bonus damage out of this. This is going to prove to have been my best damage game and one of my best XP games. I think largely because this Lexington just gave me all of their hit points, or very nearly all their hit points. I did make the mistake of trying out AP at first, though. I really should have just stuck with HE. This is too much of an angle. Broadside, absolutely, it would have been the right thing to do, but at this kind of angle, yeah. And I can't really close to the point where I'm going to get a flat broadside, because there's Lexingtons trying to kill me. But I'm doing a fairly good job of mincing their planes as well, fortunately. The armour, I was going to talk about the armour a bit. It's basically the Albemarle. It's the same 152mm belt. And like the Albemarle and like some of the other British heavy cruisers, because of that transom stern, kiting away is a particularly bad idea. You can and will get citadeled in the ass all day long. It's 25mm bow and stern armour, so the actual armour's value's not bad. Look at this, by the way. Oh yeah, no, that torpedo hasn't run out of track yet. Oh, good job, good job. But yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, it isn't great at kiting anyway, just because you have got that single rear turret. And the turret angles are not brilliant. I mean, they're not terrible, but they're definitely not brilliant. Yeah, that transom stern is an absolute killer if you're not careful, so you have to be very, very wary about that. Tanking stuff on the belt is fine, and if you're advancing towards somebody, then that can work out okay, but I mean, it's not the most super maneuverable cruiser, so you have to be very, very careful about that sort of thing overall. You have to pick and choose your times to try and advance on people, and generally speaking, trying to rush down a battleship, I've not had good experiences with that. You might get away with it if it's someone that's panicking a bit, and or maybe doesn't have the caliber to overmatch your bow. But I've tended to play this more at range and just go dark if I have to be heading away from somebody, because I've been citadeled in the ass one too many times. This is still very close on ships. We're slightly ahead, but yeah, the Vladivostok up north is being hounded. We've also got an Irian. This is one of the things I was going to point out. We have an Irian left alive. It's very unusual to see an Irian not only with multiple kills, but alive at this kind of stage of a match. Generally speaking, people do not do well in that ship. I guess it's a bit like this in that, I don't know, maybe some people fancy it for the challenge, because it's definitely a bit more challenging than the Kutuzov, just because that has the smoke to work with, whereas the Irian, of course, absolutely does not. So at this stage, I am just looking to stay reasonably safe. I've taken enough heavy damage that despite having a really good heal, I cannot get a lot of hit points back. So what I'm instead going to do is use my ballistics, which are not fantastic. They're not completely terrible, but they're not fantastic at all. These are not especially fast shells, and it's why I've only tended to use the AP at closer ranges. But it does have, of course, the advantage of being able to use island cover to fire over at things. And even though, you know, there's lots of open water between me and the North Carolina, that short range actually works in my favour at this point. I can just sit here and try and get a fire on the Vladivostok. Although really I should be trying to finish off that Chapayev. It's also a bit unfortunate for our Bismarck going down like that, although they were giving a bit too much broadside to the Vladivostok. But even so, that must have been a decent number of pens to kill them outright like that. So despite winning very nicely on points, we're having a good go at maybe trying to throw this away. And because our Lexington is all the way over on the other side of the map, they have at least been moving around compared to the enemy one, I suppose. But it means that it's not like their planes can get here very quickly. If they'd kept up with us a bit and were behind one of the islands flanking the B-cap, for example, they could be cycling their planes a lot quicker than they are. But as it is, no. I did consider here pushing out maybe trying to do, or try and finish off that Vladivostok, or maybe do a bit more up against the North Carolina. But I don't particularly trust this armour against battleships. If you can tank on the bow, on the not on the bow, on the belt, then that can work out just fine. But you know, 16-inch guns are going to go through that nose without too much difficulty. So it pays to be cautious in this ship. Some maps are going to suck. Other maps are going to work much better if you have that island cover to work with. So nearly 40 plane kills, including of course a bunch of fighters. Only 1 kill in terms of ships, but I got the AA Defense Expert and 2600 base XP, so overall pretty good. As you can see, not that many, I mean, out of the fire set, 26,000 damage even. It's not as much as it could be. Most of that was actually from just peppering away with the shells, which, as I've said, you know, they're fairly substantial. They feel good to use, these guns. And for having these guns at tier 8, it does feel like you have an appropriate other amount of challenges to work with. So yeah, overall I was quite pleased with that result, and I've not actually managed to better it in terms of damage. So here we go, this is the setup I'm using. Fairly standard, the rudder shift in slot 4, and like I said, double rudders would be incredibly viable. You could go for maximum concealment, that would also work. I'm not convinced the ship consumables buff is enough to really be worthwhile, honestly, but you know, that's what I'm trying for the time being. Lastly, we come to captain skills, which I know I'm a bit inconsistent about covering, but on a lot of ships it's basically, you know, take a standard battleship loadout, take a standard cruiser loadout. There's quite often not that much to choose from. With the Cheshire though, well, I mean, you can see this is the captain I've been using with the Surrey. 19-point captain, and it fits pretty well, so this makes for a good captain trainer for the line generally. It's another positive of this ship, is it unlike sometimes you get premiums that just don't fit with the rest of the line at all and they need their own captain. That's not the case with the Cheshire, and really the only thing you might consider doing differently than this is BFT instead of Demo Expert, because your HE fire chance and your AA DPS are both really good for the tier, so it then just becomes a case of personal preference as to which one you want to be better. You could do some other more niche things like more of a survivability build. Maybe you could take Torpedo Vigilance and match that up with using the Hydro if that's your bag, but otherwise, yeah, I don't really think there's anything major I'd change here. Certainly none of the other 4th point captain skills particularly fit. IFHE, for instance, which might be kind of useful more on one of the 203 mil ships, definitely doesn't have any place on the Cheshire. You've got 58mm of HE penetration, which is enough for the deck of the mighty Kremlin, which you will meet from time to time. It's just the scary part's going to be getting to within 16 kilometers of it. So yeah, and of course with the changes coming up to IFHE, cutting your fire chance in half for a heavy cruiser is just generally not going to be worth it, I don't think. So that's about it, I think. There's not really much more to say. I give this one a thumbs up, and like I say, it's a good line captain trainer. It's a reasonably fun ship to play in its own right, and overall it feels pretty balanced. So yeah, I think a thumbs up on this one. It certainly hits the mark a lot more than the London did, that's for sure. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it and found it useful, and if you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath it, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.